I see the little record button up in the top.
Yep, we're on record.
Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here. We've had some great presentations the last 2 months on some old on some of the founding members, some of the legendary people, Greg Manson and Harold Schindler. Thanks.
Well, wait.
We lost you,
You're
Ken.
muted, Ken.
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now, and it won't look like I'm just moving my. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Ken, sorry,
Okay.
I muted you by an accident.
Oh no, I'm sorry. So did you hear anything I said, or should I start over?
We heard it.
Okay. So so we had these two great presentations on Brig and on Hal, and now we're going to go back more to our regular scheduled presentations. Tom was supposed to give a presentation in March, which he wouldn't have been able to do because of some health issues. So that was certainly not propitious, but it was convenient that the month we missed is a month where we would have had to scramble because Tom was in the hospital and we wanted to hear from him. But so we're back onto more of a regular schedule. This month we'll hear from Tom Alexander. I'll introduce him in a minute. He asked me to introduce him, which flattered me. I've known Tom and admired him greatly for many, many years. Next month, breaking news is that we have found a movie that's in the public domain, which Jim Dark believes is up to our standards. It's called Proud Rebel. It's with Alan Ladd and Olivia de Havilland. It was made in Iron County in 1958. I'm not quite sure why it's in the public domain, but Jim says it's in the public domain, and that the hope is we'll be able to stream the movie through Zoom, have an introduction from Jim, have commentary afterwards from Jim. Maybe we'll be able to try to fit Joe Hatch's short on Decker Hill in as well. And we'll have kind of our standard thing. Everybody will need to bring popcorn and eat hot dogs at home, and we'll have our standard movie next month if all goes well. You'll hear more as we get newsletters out and that sort of thing next month. But plan on it. We have Laura. Are you on? I think we have two new members. One is Lisa Michelle Church, who I understood was going to be here tonight. Lisa, are you here?
Turn on the video.
Yeah, if I had more than 4 people, I could probably see if Lisa's here.
I don't think Lisa's on.
Okay.
Lisa, if you're here and you're trying to respond, your microphone's muted, but just hold down the space bar and talk.
My guess is Lisa's having to do lots of Zoom meetings these days with all the stuff she's doing. Anyway, so Lisa's great. We'll have a nice introduction in the newsletter next month of Lisa, who is a lawyer. She's an independent historian. She's a public servant. We've heard from her before. She's great, and will be a wonderful contributing member of Utah Westerners. The other new member is Jeff Nichols, who's a history professor at Westminster College and is also great. Some of you may have read his book, which is called something like Prostitution, Polygamy, and Power. I may have that wrong. It's a very interesting book. Jeff is also a new member, and we, as I say, we'll have more information about the two of them. Brad Westwood just sent me a text saying he was not going to be here, couldn't attend tonight, but they have the Historical Society is doing an upcoming series called Salt Lake West Side Stories. Looks like some of them are about African Americans in Salt Lake, some of them are about LGBTQ members of the LGBTQ community in Salt Lake. And they're going to have these. There are some blog teasers about these. It starts in July, and Will is one of the advisors to the series, Will Bagley, and we'll get you the information out so you can know. I assume it's going to be virtual. I don't think they're doing anything in person yet. Do any of you have any announcements you would like to present to our group? If you want to talk, just hit your space bar. That will unmute you. You can speak up, or you can forever hold your peace for at least a little while.
Thank you for everybody. I'm proud to be a new member and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Is that Jeff?
It is.
Jeff, welcome, welcome. And as I say, we will introduce you properly in our newsletter next week. These two new members are extraordinarily accomplished and cool and wonderful additions to Utah Westerners. We don't have any books to give away. We don't, we're just so different than how we usually are when we don't meet together, but we're making the best of what we can. I'm going to introduce Tom. I have to mention that today, June 16th, 2020, is my mother's would have been my mother's 100th birthday.
Oh,
Unfortunately, she died a year and a half ago at the age, as she said, of 98 and a half. The only reason I bring that up is that my mom and my dad both were very, very fond of Tom Alexander and his wife, Marilyn. They live in kind of the same area of Provo. And my parents, who were a little bit older, sort of faculty family there in Provo, have always had extraordinarily high regard for the Alexanders. Tom, as all of you know, is an extraordinary scholar, historian, teacher, mentor, and person. I've had the opportunity of seeing this closely over the past 40 plus years, and can only tell you, from my perspective, Tom is the real deal. He is the Lemuel Harrison Redd Professor of History Emeritus at Brigham Young University. He served for many years as the director of the Redd Center there at BYU. He was awarded BYU's highest faculty award, the Carl G. Mazur Distinguished Faculty Lecturer Award. His scholarship is prodigious. He has authored, co-authored, and edited, now get this, 26 books and monographs and over 200 articles. Many of his works have been seminal, others are only very important. His biography of Mormon prophet Wilford Woodruff is one of the best biographies in Mormon history. My personal favorite of Tom's books is his Mormonism in Transition, A History of Latter-day Saints, 1890 to 1930, which he updated not too long ago, mostly because I love this period of history, and it's the best thing done for that period. He has won many of the major awards offered in Western and Mormon history. He's been president of the Mormon History Association, the Pacific branch of the American Historical Association, president of the Utah Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters, chair of the Utah Board of State History, chair of the Utah Humanities Council, and he is a fellow of the Utah State Historical Society. One thing about Tom that I have always appreciated is that he is never afraid to share his carefully arrived at opinions. And from my viewpoint, he has added greatly to the scholarly discussion around historical issues that many of us, most of us, all of us find very interesting. Personally, I worked for several years as a research assistant to Professor Alexander when I was a law student and graduate student. I worked mostly on Western public land policy, which is, Tom is just as eminent in that area as he is in Utah and Mormon history. And the other time, I worked for Tom and Jim Allen on their history of Salt Lake City. Not only did I get to read the Salt Lake Tribune, the Salt Lake Herald, and the Deseret News for most of the 19th century while they were in existence, I was introduced to many of the subjects on which I have written and published over the past 40 years. And so it was just extraordinarily beneficial to me, and I hope I was a good research assistant to them and to Tom.
you certainly were.
Thank you. So one of the things I appreciate about Tom is he's very creative. And I'll give you a personal example, and it's not a very good example, but it is an example. And that is, in my history program, I decided I wanted to write a social history of baseball in early Salt Lake City. And most of the members of my committee looked at me and thought, wait a minute, you're kind of a smart guy, and what the hell are you writing about baseball for? Tom took a very different view, and I think by and large, through his guidance and shepherding me through, I think it turned out pretty well and was actually a relatively serious piece of history. I would call Professor Alexander the preeminent historian of Utah and the LDS Church for the period from the 1880s to about 1930, which I think he is, but that would be unduly limiting. His work on earlier periods and on individuals are simply too good and too important to limit him to such a short time period. Tom's most recent book, Brigham Young and the Expansion of the Mormon Faith, published last year by the University of Oklahoma, is superb. He will draw on that this evening in his presentation on Brigham Young and the Latter-day Saint transformation of Utah wilderness from 1847 to 1858, which brings two of the subjects Tom knows most about, Mormon history and Western land use. I present to you Professor Tom Alexander, gifted scholar, teacher, thinker, mentor, and man. Tom?
Thank you, Ken. That's very kind of you. Today, I want to talk about some of the problems the Latter-day Saints faced under Brigham Young's leadership during the first decade that they lived in Utah. That is, from about 1847 until 1858. As most of you know, Orson Pratt and Erastus Snow had arrived in the Salt Lake Valley on July 21st. The majority of the company entered the valley on July 22nd, and they began plowing and planting on July 23rd. Brigham Young was very ill. He was laying in the back of Wilford Woodruff's carriage with what they called mountain fever. That was probably Colorado tick fever. On July 24th, Wilford Woodruff drove him to the overlook of the valley in Immigration Canyon. A number of years later, Wilford Woodruff said that Brigham Young had told them, "This is the right place, drive on." Now, I suspect that many of you have heard when they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, many of the people were disappointed because they saw the area as a forsaken wilderness. Well, that story actually developed later. When they first arrived, many of them considered a beautiful and potentially productive place. Wilford Woodruff's diary on July 24th said something quite different from the story we often hear. He wrote on July 24th, "We gazed with wonder upon a valley of such vast extent, surrounded with mountains like pyramids, towering towards heaven, presenting the grandest and most sublime scenery, probably, that could be obtained on the globe." Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff thought this was a beautiful place. They thought it was a wilderness, but it was something that they could tame and transform into towns and farms. Now, Utah's wilderness had a number of numerous previous inhabitants. We don't know exactly how many Indians lived in Utah before the Mormons came, but some estimates place it at 40,000 or more. These were principal Numics, Utes, Shoshones, Paiutes, Goshutes, and some Dene, that is Navajo. These people had shaped the land already by farming, hunting, fishing, and other activities. It's true that the Latter-day Saints called the area a wilderness, but it's something that was quite different from the wilderness of the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Wilderness Act said the earth was a community of life untrammeled by man. It's a place where man is a visitor and does not remain. The Indians had shaped Utah's land, and they certainly didn't consider it a wilderness. The Mormons expected to shape it by work. The Indians, Paiutes particularly, in the Virgin and Santa Clara River valleys carried on extensive agriculture, growing corn and melons. In Utah previously, the Fremont and ancestral Pueblo peoples had carried on agriculture. They domesticated turkeys and they grew corn and beans and melons. Latter-day Saint culture was much different from the culture of the Native Americans that they encountered here in Utah. They expected to reshape Deseret into something like the lands that they had known in the East and Midwest. They had come during a hot summer, and they knew that they were going to have to irrigate in order to grow crops on the land. But they expected that God would temper the elements for them. Now, I don't know how many letters to the editor I've read in the Tribune that say that the Wasatch Front is a desert. I would refer you to an article by Richard Jackson in the Utah Historical Quarterly a number of years ago that contrasts the relatively well-endowed Wasatch Front with the real deserts in southern Utah. If you turn to the Kirpin-Geiger climate classification system, we learn that the Wasatch Front is a warm, temperate, or dry summer continental climate. In Utah City, in Salt Lake City, the average precipitation is 16.5 inches a year. And contrary to the conventional wisdom, most of that precipitation doesn't come in the winter, but in the spring months of March, April, and May. Now, with 16 inches of precipitation, you can carry on agriculture. Unfortunately, along the Wasatch Front, it comes in the wrong time, the wrong season of the year, so we have to irrigate. Later, of course, dry farming techniques were developed by John A. Whitsoe and others, but during the mid-19th century, farmers had to irrigate. We owe a great deal to Will Bagley for publishing part of Thomas Bullock's journal. Many of you have heard people say that there were no trees in the valley when the pioneers came. Brian Cannon told me that his grandfather took him to see what was the only tree in the valley while he was a little boy. At any rate, Bullock said that the pioneer party camped near a grove of cottonwood trees. Now, I don't know about your mathematics skill, but the word grove doesn't ordinarily mean one tree or no trees. In fact, they found very rich vegetation where they first camped. They found western wheatgrass 6 or 7 feet high and other kinds of grasses 10 to 12 feet high. The area was not a desert or a baked plain. It was, as Bullock wrote, fertile, friable loam with fine gravel. They had to cut the grass in order to plow, and they plowed the ground and planted it. And they turned City Creek on to irrigate the crops. You should find it interesting to compare John Locke's view of how human beings acquired the right to private property with Brigham Young's. Most of you are familiar with John Locke because of his second treatise on civil government. Thomas Jefferson drew on Locke's views to write the Declaration of Independence. Locke was a religious man. He believed that God owned the property, that is, the earth, but human beings could convert it into their own private property by mixing their labor with it. Brigham Young knew that the Mormons had moved into an Indian-owned wilderness, and he gave some speeches in which he said so. But like Locke, he also believed that God owned the land, but he said that God's representatives could distribute it to those who could convert it into private property by mixing their labor with it. So his views were similar to Locke's, except in who could distribute the land here on the earth. The Mormons wanted to convert the land into something like the towns and farms that they had occupied in the East and Midwest. Brigham Young was very much opposed to people who took up the land and would not develop it, particularly if they held it for speculation. At first, he said they should give it back to him and he would distribute it to someone else. And then later he said he wanted them to distribute it themselves to someone else. The counties in Utah, under the jurisdiction of what was then called county courts, we would call them today county commissions or county governments, distributed the land under a law that was passed by the territorial legislature in 1852. You paid $1 for surveying the land and 50 cents for the county recorder to record your title. Now, the Mormons knew that these titles were only temporary. They knew that they didn't really own the land, and they sent numerous petitions to Washington asking for the federal government, for Congress particularly, to pass laws that would extend the land laws to Utah so they could obtain legal titles. That didn't happen until 1869, and it only took place then because the railroad needed to have a land office in order to get the land from their land grants. In the meantime, the Mormons had to settle themselves with a color of title, which was issued by the county governments, and it was transferred by quitclaim deeds from one owner to another as the land transferred hands. Salt Lake City grew very rapidly. The property in Salt Lake City that people had purchased for $1.50 in 1849 and immediately after was selling for as much as $1,000 a lot in downtown Salt Lake by mid-1851. Brigham Young said the land belonged to the Indians, as I indicated. He said if you didn't plow it, you shouldn't be able to keep the land. But settlers knew that they were going to have to get clear titles from the federal government. Brigham Young expected the Latter-day Saints to extend their settlements throughout the West. They will extend their settlements to the east and west, to the north and south. We'll build towns and cities by the hundreds, and thousands will gather. Brigham Young said that people could sell their lots or their inheritance, as it's sometimes called, and go to other places after they'd improved their land. He also hoped to encourage the government to build a railroad. He said that if a transcontinental railroad were constructed, you could cross from London to China in 75 days and back again. Now, I'm not sure how he expected to do that in the age of the sailboat, but that's what he thought. He told the Saints to plant instead of prospecting for gold, and he said he'd be giving that sometime people would be willing to give a barrel of gold for a barrel of flour. Now, he did send George Buchanan and some others to California to mine for gold, but he expected most of the Saints to farm and develop towns and cities. He also welcomed other people than Mormons to Utah, but he expected them to be civil to his people, not to blaspheme God, Joe Smith, or his religion. The settlers tried to build a community under Brigham Young's leadership. Brigham Young was a mercantilist. A mercantilist expects those who live in a particular community to grow and produce everything they possibly could and to trade with those outside and to develop a favorable balance of trade with themselves. He sent colonists to Cedar City to mine lead, to Las Vegas to mine iron and produce iron goods. He sent a group to Las Vegas to try to mine lead, and later he sent a group to St. George, southern Utah, to grow cotton and grapes down there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The Latter-day Saints, I think I may have gone one too far. The Latter-day Saints had a difficult time in achieving that goal. They were never really successful in doing that. Incoming immigrants pressed on the food supply each year. They had a lack of water for irrigation throughout the 1850s. The Saints experienced frost, snow, various kinds of insects, and eventually smut in their wheat. All of these disabilities called food shortages during the late 1840s and 1850s. Now, this is a list of the problems that they had and the reasons that they failed to have enough food. In 1849, there was heavy snow so that cattle couldn't get down to eat grass. A survey was taken by the presiding bishop that found that they only had enough food available until July the 9th. How they lived the rest of the year, I'm not certain. In 1850, they had a late season drought. 1852, they had a surplus, but they still lacked irrigation water as much as they ought to have had. In 1853, the early part of the year, they had enough food, but shortages were caused by drought, by lack of irrigation water, the Walker War of 1853-54, and then, of course, supplying Major Steptoe's 325 troops, 800 animals, and whole bunches of camp followers and other non-Mormons who came in that year. The Mormons didn't build any reservoirs until the construction of one in Newton in Cache Valley in 1870. As a result, they often ran short of water during late August and early September, when they really needed it in order to finish up their crops. During the 1850s, they only had sufficient food during 1852 and 1853. And in 1853, it was because they had a holdover from the previous year. In 1857, they had a killing frost on May 9th. They had grasshopper invasions. And unfortunately, the Big Cottonwood Canal was completed in 1857, and that helped them to deal with the problem. In 1858, they had problems in part because of the coming of the Army. Few farmers were left in Salt Lake City to irrigate crops. Most of the people had moved to Provo. They had drought, and they had smut problems after that. Now, this slide shows the average precipitation in Salt Lake City, a long-term average compared with what they had in 1858. Now, in January, they didn't have very much. In February, they had more than normal. In March, it was somewhat less. April, they had more than normal. By May, which was ordinarily one of the wettest months, they had very little precipitation. The same was true in June. They had about average, but they really needed more. In July, they had less than average. In August and September, much less than average. They had a whole lot of precipitation in October of 1858, but by that time it was too late to meet the needs of their crops. In November, it was somewhat below average, and of course they had very little. So for the entire year, they had just about 14.5 inches, when they really should have had 16.5, which was supposed to be the average. Now, they made some early attempts to try to deal with the problem of crops shortage, basically by trying to control animals, either their own animals or animals that attacked crops. In 1849, under the leadership of Daniel Spencer, people were encouraged to build fences, and at that time they had to build wooden fences because barbed wire had not been invented. There were 2 patents, one in 1867, a Smith patent, and in 1874, the Glidden patent, which is like most of the barbed wire fences that we see today. In 1848-49, they tried to control the range by rounding up stock and bringing them into Salt Lake City, the stock that the people didn't get themselves. Then in 1848-49, they decided that they were going to wage war against what were called wasters and destroyers. And in order to do that, they divided up into 2 groups, one that was headed by John Pack and the other that was headed by John D. Lee. And they were trying to figure out how to deal with this, and they decided that they would count the number of animals that were killed by each of the 2 parties, and the one that killed the most animals would get to have a dinner that was served by the other party. So they went out looking for wolves and foxes and crows and hawks and other animals that might eat their crops or their cattle. Unfortunately, they couldn't agree on the count. Does a dead crow, for instance, count the same as a dead fox? Nobody seemed to be able to figure that out. And so nobody got the dinner. Now, Brigham Young also tried to attack food profiteers. Generally, historians have said that the immigrants on the road to California were a real boon for the Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. Well, they were for people who could sell to them, but there were profiteers who bought up food and sold it to these immigrants, and there was often very little food for poor Mormons. In 1849, Brigham Young was opposed at first to setting some kind of an embargo to prevent the sale of that food. And he said, let every man use his influence to put down extortion. Well, in 1850, Brigham Young realized that that kind of a program wouldn't work. You couldn't do it by charity. So he said, and this is a quotation from John D. Lee's diary, who was in the meeting, if those that have do not sell to those that have not, we will just take and distribute it among the poor. In 1850, Brigham Young rebuked millers who sold flour to the immigrants, robbed people of their bread. He tried to control speculators who sold to travelers. In 1853, he said that he considered selling food supplies that were needed to feed the Mormons immoral. And in 1855, I see some men so greedy after things of the world, they would take their grain from the mouths of innocent, helpless women and children and sell it to Gentile merchants to speculate on. Do not, he said, turn away those that are in need. Now, the Saints didn't sit by with those things like they did during 1849 and 50. They built canals from the Jordan River in 1850, from Mill Creek in 1849 and 50, Little Cottonwood Creek in 1849 and 50. These were smaller irrigation systems. The largest drainage area in the Salt Lake Valley comes from Big Cottonwood Creek. And what they needed to do, and Brigham Young realized this, was to construct a canal from Big Cottonwood Creek into downtown Salt Lake City to irrigate the crops that were south of current Night South, and then reaching into Davis County. And they were successful in doing that. Like all of these projects, this was a community project. Sometimes they had 300 men out during several weeks digging the canal. All of the work was done either by hand or with horse-drawn machinery. They began a project of running the Weber River into Salt Lake Valley or into northern Davis County in 1857. There was also a problem with timber access. They didn't distribute the canyons or herd grounds as inheritances, so nobody owned those. They were common property. And what happened at first is that entrepreneurs like Orson Pratt and Willard Richards built roads into the canyons. Violence resulted when interlopers used the roads and refused to pay tolls. The people who built the roads expected that they would be able to get tolls from those who used the roads that they constructed. Brigham Young was quite upset about this. And so in a general conference in 1852, he ordered the county courts to grant road franchises. And they would let entrepreneurs build roads and pay for the cost of construction through tolls. He said in his talk, and you remember he was governor of the territory at this time, this is an order not from the governor of the territory. You won't see anything about this in the newspaper as a pronouncement from the governor. This is from the president of the church. And he wanted them all to do it for that reason. In 1852, the legislature assigned regulation of the timber and herd grounds to the county courts. County courts then began requiring the filing of a bond. Prospective users had to survey the herd ground. They were issued a permit that lasted for a year. And in 1857 and 1858, some legislation was given by the legislature to give grants for herd grounds to some individuals. Brigham Young, for instance, got Cache Valley as a herd ground for the church's herds and for his own herds. Many of the federal officials were opposed to what Brigham Young was doing. Surveyor General David Burr sent a letter to the United States Attorney General pointing out that settlers had to pay grantees for timber and firewood. And of course, what he was talking about was paying tolls for using that. And he said minions of the priesthood controlled the herd grounds. This letter from David Burr was one of the letters that the president collected, but he didn't publish it, that brought about the sending of the army against Utah in 1857. Now, while Brigham Young was battling the elements, he also developed an environmental philosophy. He said everything, the air, the water, the grass, belongs to our Father in heaven. You are not at liberty to foul the water, but let it run free for all. He said the earth was banished from its more glorious state for man's sake. So he didn't think the earth had originally been in the place that it is now. He said the tides act like the beating of a man's heart, since the earth is a living thing. And he said the spirit constitutes the life of everything you see. Rocks, mountains, grass, flowers, trees, all had spirits, and they were living beings. A superior power springs the seed into life. You plant the seed, but a superior power brings it to life. He said the spirits in the blades of grass, no two of which are exactly alike, engender the variety in nature. Well, he designated some places for wilderness or for parks. City Creek Canyon, he designed to leave every little shrub in the creek. I will take care of it, he said. He applied this to Lower City Creek, since he and others logged in the Upper Creek. And now all of you know that City Creek today is a city park. And it is that because Brigham Young designed it to be that. In Big Cottonwood Canyon, where he was holding one of the 24th of July celebrations, here are the stupendous works of nature. Calmly meditate on the wonderful works of God and his kind providence. Now, what about all of this? After the shortages of 1848, some historians have generally seen conditions as improving. Actually, there were food shortages every year between 1848 and 1858, except 1852, 1853, part of 1853, and part of 1857. Food shortages again recurred during the 1860s because of locust invasions, and the environmental aspect of the conflict led in part to the Utah War, resulted from efforts by the Mormons to regulate the use of resources in the public interest. That is, they wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to have herd grounds and to get timber, but to regulate it so that nobody would monopolize it. Okay, basically that's what I wanted to talk about. Now I'd be glad to take questions if any of you have any, and we'll see how many I can't answer.
I was very pleased that he was an environmentalist. Very pleased to hear that he felt that the earth was everyone's and no one in particular should dominate it.
Yeah, he felt that way, but he wasn't exactly an environmentalist in the modern sense, because he did believe that people ought to cut timber and that they ought to graze on the land, and he was in favor of development, but he thought that it ought to be done in an orderly way rather than simply turning everybody loose onto the land.
Tom, could you tell us how the transfer of property occurred in the
Yes.
1860s?
During that, until, you mean after the federal government set up the land office or before?
After.
After. The Mormons, of course, had already taken up a lot of the land, and they surveyed themselves, and the federal government had surveyed land. Unfortunately, those two systems didn't overlap one another. And what usually happened is that one among a group of people would file for the land and then distribute it through either through payment or as part of a homestead, where you only had to pay a filing fee for it, to the other people who were actually occupying the land. In a lot of cases, that was done by the local bishop. In other cases, it was done by people who were part of a group. You know, the farming lots in Salt Lake County, south of Salt Lake City, were either 5, 10, or 20 acre lots. And that's much less than you could get either under the Preemption Act or the Homestead Act. And so because those lots had been taken up under that customary system with the county court, it was necessary for somebody to file on them and then distribute it to others.
You look at the county recorder's papers, you'll find that Silas Richards, who was the Bishop of Union Fort, he designated a certain amount of land for Green Flake to possess. Green Flake was a black pioneer who came in with Brigham Young in 47, and he actually owned property there in Union because Silas Richards was able to sell him his portion from a much larger piece of property.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
Everybody's still muted.
I have a question. This is Stuart.
Sure.
Hinckley. Why does Utah only end up with 29 counties compared to other states which have numerous counties?
Counties are created by the state legislature. Well, first by the territorial legislature and by the state legislature. And that's all that they created. There's an interesting master's thesis by Jim Allen that was done at Brigham Young University on the development of county boundaries. And that shows how those boundaries developed in the throughout the state. What's now Juab County, for instance, used to belong to Utah County, and the county court distributed lots in Nephi and other places in the county. But then the legislature creates the counties.
How are the property of close to the all the canals that were spread out through Utah, or especially Salt Lake Valley? If you looked at an old map, there was tons of all these small little canals. I have property in Murray where I live, and we've got like 24 shares of a little brown ditch. But I was just curious, when it was set up, who actually set up the distribution of the water rights?
Well, the county courts did that.
Okay.
Under a law that was passed in 1852, the county courts decided about the distribution of water. And until 1880, when for the first time, the state acknowledged primary rights and secondary rights. Until that time, the county courts redistributed water to people as they were needed when new settlers came in and that kind of thing. After 1880, that wasn't possible because of the law that set up primary rights and secondary rights. But the county courts were the ones that did that. And then after 1880, the county selectmen, until Utah became a state, when we started having county commissioners, were the ones that decided when there were disputes over primary rights or secondary rights, how that should be distributed. And in some cases, the cases actually went to the Utah district courts, and some of them ended in the Utah Supreme Court, trying to determine who actually had a right to the water and how much they could take.
Thank you.
Tom, this is Walter. Can you hear me?
Who is this?
Walter?
Oh, Walter. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, have you published anything regarding this research you talked about tonight? And two, what other land use research have you done?
Oh, boy. Yes, I published an article on this, and I'm trying to remember where it was published. I'm sorry, I don't remember. I can find out though, Walter, and then I'll email you and let you know.
Please do.
And then I published a history of Region 4 of the Forest Service. I've published, I published a book on the activities of the Interior Department in the 19th century, and a quarter of that book deals with land policy and distribution of land. And then I published several other articles on environmental problems in Utah. One of them most recently in the last Utah Historical Quarterly.
Well, thank you.
I just wanted to point out that these county courts established what were called precincts.
How did the
Establish what?
Precincts.
Oh, yes.
And those precincts had what were called justice of the peace and constables, fence viewers that were supposed to watch, make sure everyone put a fence around their property. They had water masters. They had school districts in each of the precincts, which were coterminous with the wards, the LDS wards. And so all of this was functioning under the county court system and applied to the, and it had a direct impact on the locals.
Yeah, that's right.
Tom, what kind of interplay was there between sort of existing property rights that had been set up sort of by the Mormons, by the territory, and when the federal government came in and tried to, I mean, I've seen several old land patents signed by George Q. Cannon. I have no idea. People love to show me that because they go, oh, it was George Q. Cannon. Going, I have no idea why he was signing land patents. And I assume that the federal government had something to say about that when they sort of started controlling the property themselves.
Well, everybody had to get a patent from the federal government. These land patents or titles that were issued by the county governments weren't strictly legal. They were customary, and they were generally accepted by the people, though there were a number of efforts on the part of both Mormons and non-Mormons to take land away from other people, claim jumpers. But finally, the property had to be distributed by the federal government. Now, in cities, the mayor could pay for the land that was within a city, within the city boundaries, and then sell it, distribute it to the people within a city. Was George Buchanan involved in that?
The ones I've seen are sort of big tracts of land, you know, like up East Canyon or up the Weber, or I don't think they're city patents. They're rural. As I say, I have no idea why he would have been signing those.
Yeah, I don't know. In Salt Lake City, let's see. Daniel H. Wells was the mayor of the city at the time that the city purchased the land within the city. from the federal government. You know, there were all these claims that were made, and he had to figure out how to distribute it to the people that had titles under the territorial system. It must have been really messy.
So I've got a question. How did it happen that the federal government gained such excessive ownership and control of the state of Utah? I think the percentage ownership is only one other state has greater federal ownership, and I believe that's Nevada. But how come so much of Utah is owned by the federal government?
Well, it was owned by the federal government originally. They purchased it from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the only land that anybody other than the federal government owned was the land that private individuals purchased from it, or that were land grants to the railroads. It just happened that a lot of Utah either wasn't purchased or couldn't be. But the federal government owned all the land to begin with.
I heard the other day that figure was 66% federal ownership.
Yeah. And in Nevada, it's about 80%.
Tom, this is Walter again. The drought period of the 50s, was that repeated again and again up to the Great Depression?
The difficulties that they had having enough food, no, it wasn't. After they built the Big Cottonwood Canal and other areas built canals, diverted water from larger streams like the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Provo River, then people were able to get enough food generally to subsist themselves. And it helped also after the railroad came, because food could be shipped in economically into Utah. In 1869, when the railroad got to Ogden, for instance, when it got there, of course, before the railroad joined at Promontory, the price of wheat actually dropped because wheat could be shipped from the Midwest to Utah, and that helped to deal with the problem of food shortages.
Thank you.
Tom, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, is that Scott?
Yeah, it is. We have a question. In Hiram, which is where I am right now, where I live, we became a co-op city under Brigham Young's advice in, I think, the early 1870s. And as part of that, property was distributed through the bishop and also mayor, and we established co-ops in the valley and also up in Blacksmith Fork Canyon. We had a dairy up there. And history is that in the 1880s, because these lands were never patented, people would go up and file patents to the U.S. Claim Office and be able to expropriate the land, essentially kick the church off and take it over. Are you aware of that at all? And was there a conflict with land tenure back then?
There were conflicts during a lot of periods, and I'm not surprised that may have happened up in Hiram. I really don't know the history of what happened up there.
Well, it had to do with Brigham Young wanting...
No, I mean, I know about the establishment of the United Order in Hiram, but I don't know anything about this problem with claim jumping on the land.
Well, it was just refiling on land that had never been filed on in the first place, but essentially just sort of as part of the co-op. I think the dairy up in what's now near the Hardware Ranch was part of that co-op.
Seems like the bishop must have been negligent in not filing on the land for the people and distributing titles, at least, to the people that could have been given back to the co-op.
Exactly.
I don't know about that though, because I don't know enough about the history of Hiram to be able to really make a good judgment about that. Sorry, Scott.
That's okay.
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes. Was that
It's Kurt. Yes, sir.
It
Enjoyed
says
your
fire
presentation.
by your name.
Yeah, my wife said that not only am I Kurt, but I'm brusque. But that's a whole other.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm sure that everybody watching has either read your book or my review of it, right? That was very kindly reprinted in this month's newsletter. But a Westerner came in today and bought the last copy we have available, but we can order more.
Please do so.
Yes, so just let me know. And Ken, I do actually still have a free book from last time. Nobody took me up on the offer to get West from Fort Bridger when Will talked about that and Hal Schindler. So if the first person to contact us here that wants that, we'll give them a copy of that West from Fort Bridger. But anyway, Tom, it's a important book, and I'm so glad you wrote it. You've written so many terrific books that are make Utah history and Mormon history rich. So, and thanks for being with us today.
That's kind of you to say, Kurt.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think at times about, well, I don't know if it is or not, but if there's more questions, let's take them one or two more, and then we need to wrap it up. Anybody else have a question? Tom, this has been wonderful. It's very interesting stuff that I don't think many of us knew much about, and it's been very interesting and insightful. And I've got to finish your book. I've got it started. I just haven't finished it yet.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks so much for doing this. Thank you all for showing up and participating in this evening. For those of you who haven't paid your dues, you'll be getting an email from me asking you to pay up. Just send a check to Craig Smith. His address is in the newsletter, and we need the money. We are trying very hard to continue to do exactly what we've been doing. The moment that we can meet live again, we'll do that. For those of you who don't live here, we're going to figure out a way that you will be able to participate as well, so that we'll have some people participating remotely and some hopefully participating in person. We'll give you information about how to watch the movie. We'll have Jim Dark give us his expert commentary again. So we'll continue that tradition. We found a movie that we could actually stream, which Jim believes is of sufficient quality that we should watch it. It's a hard thing to stream movies that are subject to copyright.
Okay, is that it?
Sorry, I lost my connection briefly there. I don't know if other people did or not. Anyway, so we'll keep doing this as long as we need to. We'll find interesting things to have. We're going to watch a movie next month. We'll have Walter Jones in August, which will be great. And I appreciate all your participation. And Craig, what do we want to do? Do we want to leave it on for a few minutes if people want to chat, or do we close it down?
Whatever.
If some of you want to socialize, we'll leave the Zoom program open, and you can find each other on and talk if you want to for a little while.
Hey,
Thank you so much.
Walter. Walter, Larry Boreal. Just thought I'd say hello.
Hello.